Boardroom Bound, episode 137, The Ins and Outs of Membership in the Boardroom with Larry Stybel.
You have to first assess where are you on the food chain right now and what's the next logical step up for you, and be strategic about it. At the bottom might be the professional associations, human service agencies. Fine, that's a good place to start, but don't plan to stay there too long. Give it, 3 or 4 years, but then move to the next level, which might be a private company or a private equity-dominated board of directors.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Larry Stybel. Now, Larry is really interesting, the perspective he's going to bring, because he is involved in leading an outplacement agency, but also a retained search firm for board members. And so he's going to talk about the expertise that he brings, and the focus of his space, and they also have a website, boardoptions.com, is about the nominating and governance committees, about educating them, preparing them. So he's going to bring all of that stuff, especially the executive search firm stuff that he does, and the educating and preparing nominating and governance committee members. And of course, they help people get onto board seats. He's going to bring all of that expertise into what we're talking about today. Direct fit for all of you.
Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about director certification. Want to join your first board, or are you looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach. Now, through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Coaching and Certification course, you get both modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated within one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency Designation upon course completion. It's designed for individuals and groups. You can learn more at bit.ly/IBDC-D. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/IBCDC-D. And now let's jump into the show.
Larry Stybel, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being here.
Well, I'm excited to be talking with you today because I don't think we've given enough, actually, I know we haven't given enough attention in the past when I think about nominating governance committees, what that looks and feels like, how they can do their best in the boardroom. I know many of my listeners are very familiar with this term, thinking, I probably want to network with the chair of the NomGov committee. But of course, there's a lot more to it than just that. I know we're going to get into those sorts of things today. So I'm excited to bring your expertise to our audience. Let's start by sharing some of your background and experience, how you got into the board space, how your career grew and developed, and then we're going to talk about what you're doing today.
Thank you, Alex. Like anyone who looks at their career, it all seems so straightforward when you look behind you,
Right.
but at the time you're living it, it doesn't seem straightforward at all. And I'm a licensed doctoral level psychologist who decided to get into business. And in 1979, my partner Marianne Peabody and I created a company called Stybel Peabody Associates that still exists. We were focused on executive level outplacement. And one day we got hired by a company to work with the CEO who had been fired. And I said to the CEO, boy, you're really lucky you're with me because I can help you with get a nice resume. He says, I don't need your help for that. I've got a nice resume. I said, okay. Well, you're really lucky you're with me because I can help you network. He says, I know how to network. I don't need you for that. So finally, I asked him the question I should have asked at the beginning of our relationship. How can I help you? And his response was, I walked into a regular board of director meeting thinking it was a regular meeting, and I got fired. I never want that to happen to me again. I want to understand why I didn't see the signs, why I missed it. So the way you can help me is go to the board and help me construct what happened and why I didn't understand what was going on. So I started working with the board on that issue. Eventually, people found out that I was working with boards, and I was asked to do a board of directors search. So, what am I going to say? I'm a consultant. Of course I could do a board search. So we needed something to differentiate Stybel Peabody, which is an outplacement firm, from board of director retained search. So we created Board Options and boardoptions.com, and that's how we got started.
It seems so simple, doesn't it? But I think let's unpack that story, because that's fantastic. When I think about a board role, some people have different theories on exactly what they're supposed to do. For me, one of the most important things they could possibly do is find the CEO, nurture the CEO, and sometimes replace the CEO. So key things there. Sometimes you have to have the CEO to leave. Not necessarily an easy thing to do. And I imagine for some board people, imagine listening to this going, wow, I might have to fire a CEO someday. That sounds like a really tough, hard thing for an organization to do. What does that look and feel like when there's a board in transition? Are they in flux? How does that come about? Most people probably can't imagine what that'd be like in that room.
Well, when we talk about boards of directors, the analogy I would make is you take a 6-month-old boy, 6-year-old boy, 16-year-old boy, 16-year-old male. At one level, you can say these are all males and these are all human beings, and you'd be correct. At another level, each of those people are very different with different dynamics, and it's the same with boards. When somebody says, I want to be on a board of directors, I say, well, that's nice, but what kind of board?
Exactly.
And so we look at, there's a food chain of boards of directors. And it starts at the bottom of the food chain with professional associations, neighborhood human service organizations, and then it moves at the very top to Fortune 100 companies that are public. And in between, you got all sorts of other kinds of boards, like family businesses that are looking at successions, private companies that are thinking about IPO, small cap public companies, large cap public companies, private equity dominated boards of directors, venture capital dominated board of directors. Each of them has unique characteristics. Mm-hmm. And so when somebody says, I want to be on a board, my next question is, okay, what kind of board? Mm-hmm. So, and you're right. One of the core responsibilities of a board is to hire the CEO, compensate the CEO, and if necessary, fire the CEO. But of course, there are always going to be exceptions, like on many nonprofits. They just don't know how to do that, and the boards are creatures of the CEO founders. In many family businesses, the outside directors would never think about firing the CEO. Right. So it really depends on the kind of board.
And there's even so many other flavors, mutual funds, etc. We could just keep going round and round this for a whole episode. Sure. But let's come on something that's really fascinating right there. You were talking about almost like a family business where maybe the chairman was the founder, right? So it's a little awkward. There are public companies where the CEO is also the chairman, right? It really gets bizarre. Mm-hmm. Whereas other organizations, maybe they're not the same, and the chair and the CEO don't get on. That's a big problem too. It's interesting, these dynamics we don't really have in our mind when we're thinking about being a board member. But we probably wrap our head around the nomination governance committee really well. We're like, these are the people that bring on board members. And that's somewhat akin to what we were just talking about bringing on the CEO. But let's talk about NomGov, because they do a lot more than just bring on new board members. It's a wide range, and it can vary a little bit depending on the organization. How would you generally describe nominating governance committee members for our audience? And what they do as responsibility?
The big picture is that in a for-profit company. Nonprofit is a little more complicated, but in a for-profit company, there's 3 core committees. There's the compensation committee, the audit committee, and nominating and governance committee. And because of what it does the Nominating Governance Committee should be composed of outsiders. And let me define what I mean by outside directors. You have inside directors like the CEO and the CFO and the general counsel. Those are clearly insiders. Then you may have, in a family business, family members. They're clearly insiders. Then you have gray outsiders. And by gray outsiders, I mean someone who says, well, Alex is not he's an outsider. He's not a member of our family, and he's not an employee. So he's an external board member. No, he's actually gray because he was my college roommate, and we're friends, and he's really in my pocket, or we're members of the same golf club, or we belong to the same church. It's going to be difficult for Alex to really be honest with me. And then we have true outsiders. These are people who are independent in every way. And Nominating Governance Committee should be composed of true outsiders. And the core responsibility of Nominating Governance Committee: do we have the right talent on our board? The second is, do we have an educated board? And then sometimes it says, are we going to do board of directors self-evaluation where we shine the spotlight on the board itself, and how is the board improving shareholder value, or it's how is the board fulfilling its mission? So those are the core responsibilities of nominating and governance.
And I would love let's start with that last one. There's a lot to unpack here, but the self-evaluations, some boards do it much better than others. Some boards don't do it all, which is interesting. When you think about many board members, they were probably successful executives first and were used to evaluating others and having themselves be evaluated. Probably that's how they got bonused in many ways. But a lot of boards don't want to evaluate themselves, and we could argue why that is. It's interesting how all the way up the organization, people are getting evaluated, but potentially not at the board. I would love your thoughts on this.
Well, it's one of those shameful things. A little bit of history. I think it was 1999, maybe 2000. We had this Enron scandal where Enron was just doing some really, really bad things, and yet the board was totally unaware of what was going on and was letting it happen. And one of the consequences of Enron was that New York Stock Exchange and even NASDAQ required board of directors self-evaluation. In other words, the traditional role of the board is to shine a spotlight on the CEO and say, what is the CEO doing to advance shareholder value? And if the CEO is not doing enough, get rid of the CEO, replace him. That's the board's job. But the board, until recently, never had a specific mandate to shine a spotlight on itself. What are we doing as a board to advance shareholder value? What are we going to do differently? And so we had thought with Enron's disaster, more companies would get into board self-evaluation. And one of the things I'm sorry about is that the Securities and Exchange Commission never clearly defined what is board of directors self-evaluation. So it's up to each board. And so what I see with companies that I work for is some boards really take board of directors self-evaluation seriously. They hire an independent third party to come, do the evaluation, and have 1 hour session. How can we improve ourselves? This is not necessarily a criticism of an individual. It's looking at us as a board and as a culture. That's one extreme. And the other extreme, and I've seen this, is board gets a little checklist from their CPA firm, and they say, now we're going to do board of directors self-evaluation. Please spend 5 minutes answering these questions. Any questions about the questions you had? Good. it's done. Let's go play golf. So we tend to be on the side of a systematic, ongoing evaluation, but not time consuming. It should be a process rather than an event.
And I would agree with that. I'm on the board of one of the YMCAs over here, which is one of the 30 largest in the country. And I'm amazed how sophisticated some of our own systems are and how critical we are of ourselves and our willingness to do that evaluation, which is why I feel like the organization's moving in the right direction. And I think it's something a lot of organizations, whether public, private, whatever it might be, could do better at. But one of the other things you also talked about, one of the key roles for nominating governance committees, is something we can all probably get our heads around, of getting the right talent in the boardroom. And the conversation has changed a lot since I'm sure you got into the business about, okay, we should diversify from just having CEOs. We should also have CFOs. Oh, maybe we don't just need only CEOs and CFOs, and we should add more people in the C-suite. Clearly, the diversity from a gender perspective, from multicultural backgrounds in different ways is growing. So the retained search business that you guys are doing is becoming really different. What does it look like on the front lines today?
Well, I think there's another issue that you didn't mention that's absolutely worth mentioning, and that is, in the past, CEOs would dominate a lot of the process. Even though they're not on the nominating governance committee, they can sit in at meetings, and as a courtesy, CEO's voice is really taken very seriously. And the CEO would prefer to have another CEO on the board. It's never spoken, but it's kind of understood that CEOs kind of give other CEOs a benefit of a doubt that non-CEOs might not do. Mm. And so there was a bias for people with specific industry experience and CEO experience. These are the people we really want on the boards. Now, in the last 2 years, there's an increasing sensitivity to race, sex. Do we want to diversify the board in terms of these characteristics? Is it important for us to do so? And many boards are saying we do. And the consequence of that for us as recruiters is that we no longer get a search request, find me a CEO from these industries, or a recently retired CEO from these industries. It may be, find me a black female who is competent in digital marketing, and she doesn't have to be a CEO, but I'm interested in somebody whose competency is digital marketing, understands the following industries, can be of help to us, but we do want a black female. So I've gotten that. I even had a client that was a nonprofit college north of Boston. They wanted to have a black person on their board of directors, and even though 12% of their student population was black, no board member knew any competent black board members, so they hired us as a search firm to find a competent black graduate of their own school to serve on the board, which we did.
Wow. That blows my mind in so many ways. It's interesting, Larry, that I think the story used to be we can't find anybody outside our own network. So whether it's the country club, whatever it is, help us find that person. The expectations, it sounds like, have changed dramatically. Help us also understand culture, because we hear that a lot, that is often maybe what trumps or perhaps tied to the top of one of the most important things. And let's talk about it from the perspective, not only from the board trying to fill it and find the person who's a fit for them, but imagine also for the listeners of this podcast, they should be doing due diligence about board opportunities that come up to make sure they're a fit so they do well, become successful, and more opportunities come. How does culture play into all of this, and how should someone think about that as they go through the interview process?
But those are two great questions, Alex, and I'm going to answer them in two separate ways. I have seen this very weird paradox. We do work at board of directors levels. We are assessing board of director culture. At the same time, because of my Stybel Peabody work, we may be working with the same company and working on coaching at the director level So we're working at the board level, and then we're working at the director level or the VP level. And what I find is this very curious anomaly that I've never seen anything written about it. Where if I could look at the culture of the board itself, and then I look at the middle management of the company, the dysfunction that the board has from a culture point of view gets translated down to middle management and below, even though the directors that I'm working with have never been to a board meeting, wouldn't recognize anybody who's on the board, and yet the culture seeps down. There is a cliche, which biologically may not be correct, but it sounds right. When a fish rots, it rots from the head. And I have found that to be the case. When you have a dysfunctional corporate culture, look no further than the board, because usually it started there. So that would be number one. Now let me answer the second part of your question. If I was advising someone who has an opportunity to join a board, and again, I'm not going to use nonprofits in this case, just a regular for-profit company. The first question I would ask is, tell me about the outside directors of the board. Where do they come from? And if the answer is we have no outside directors, or if the answer is, well, the outside director happens to be in the same church as the president, or was the college roommate of the president, or it's the partner of the CPA firm that the company uses, that's a gray independent director. It doesn't count. So number one is I want real board members. Two, tell me about your board of directors self-evaluation program. If the response was, we don't believe in that, or if the response is, board of directors self-evaluation, what's that? That's a bad sign. If a board is serious enough about its responsibilities to evaluate itself, that is a good sign. The third sign that I ask is, who's the chairman of the board and who's the CEO? If they say, oh, it's the CEO and the chairman are the same, sometimes that'll work, but a lot of times it's going to be a conflict of interest because, again, we go back to what are the core responsibilities of the board, and the core responsibilities include evaluating the CEO's performance, hiring and firing the CEO. It's really awkward when the chair of the board is also the CEO.
Right. I think back to my time at JP Morgan before I was up here, and Jamie Dimon, who was both the chairman and CEO. Now, Jamie's the best banker of his generation. He's probably one of the few people that might be qualified to do both. But even then, how can you not do one at the expense of the other?
Right. And at the very least, it's the chair of the board who sets the agenda.
Mm-hmm.
So, a good chair of the board who wants to make sure something doesn't get discussed knows what to do, which is put that issue at the end of the agenda when everybody's looking to leave and they're looking at their watches.
Well, it's also hard to have the executive session without the CEO if you're also the chairman. But when I also think about the nominating governance committee, put my hat on, I guess one of the questions that we would step back and I'd love to get your thoughts on for all of our audience is probably thinking about this is like, when is the best time in a career to begin planning to have board options in your future? Like when are you perhaps most attractive, most sought after by the governance committee?
Again, I go back to the idea of a food chain. I would like Disney to call me to be on a member of its board because I've been to Disneyland 3 times and I've watched several Disney movies. I know I could be of great value, but I'm giving up waiting for their call. Where I'm not at the level of the food chain that Fortune 100 companies are going to call me, you have to first assess where are you on the food chain right now, and what's the next logical step up for you, and be strategic about it. So at the bottom might be the professional associations, human service agencies, a lot of nonprofits. Fine, that's a good place to start, particularly if you believe in the mission. But don't plan to stay there too long. Give it, 3 or 4 years, but then move on. Move to the next level, which might be a private company or a private equity-dominated board of directors. And give that 3 or 4 years, and then move on to the next level. To answer your question, Alex, the best time is in your mid-50s, which is a very difficult time because when you're in your mid-50s, typically you're very busy with your career. Your kids are starting to look at colleges. Being on boards is kind of the last thing that you want to think about. On the other hand, if you come to me at age 65 and you've retired and you say, now I'm ready to join a board of directors, you know what? It's too late. Because it's usually going to take you 2 years to network your way into a board opportunity. And many of the most attractive boards have term limits and mandatory age retirements. So you want to do it in your mid-50s.
Plus, they would ideally have someone who has their finger on the pulse, and probably the assumption is you can't have that as much once you've stepped away from the day-to-day.
Yeah. I also think of I'm a big believer in as part of leadership succession with a company, you should hire someone, could be me or somebody else, to come in and help some of your high potential CEO potentials get board opportunities with for-profit companies that don't compete in your space. Mm-hmm. Because being short of being a CEO itself, being on a board is a great way to begin looking at a business from an enterprise-wide perspective as opposed to a functional perspective.
And certainly brings you a great mentality and skills you bring back to your day-to-day job. I'm sold on it as well. Some companies perhaps not as much, but I think that's the argument you'd want to have internally if they weren't supportive of it.
Yeah. And again, that's just a part of corporate culture.
Right. Now, Larry, I want to make sure we spend a little bit of time about your boardoptions.com website. There's some great stuff there that I want people to hear about. So we talked about a little bit before about your seat at the table. And I know that's a closed small group of invitees only, but there are ways for people to be involved and to hear it. And can you share with us a little bit about that and the website overall?
Sure. If you go to our website, it's called boardoptions.com. It is ugly. It has, it looks like state-of-the-art 1981. But we have a lot of content. So one thing to look out for is on the lower right-hand side, from ideas to action. We've been doing seat at the table programs every month for the last 11 years, so we have well over 100 programs. Every time we do a seat at the table program, someone writes a small case, not Harvard Business School, but usually a case involving a board facing a dilemma. What are you going to do as a board member? Example, we are a private equity portfolio company. One of the two founders has always been angry about the compensation. Still, a lot of the special sauce of the company is in this person's head. He's now sort of put it to us, you either increase my compensation or I'm leaving. You don't want to keep a guy like that in your company, but you can't afford to let him go. Mm-hmm. What are you going to do as a board member? Those are the kinds of things that we deal with. And then you can read the case and then listen to a discussion of 25 to 30 board members who read the case and came up with their own conclusions. So that's one resource. Second resource, on the right side of the homepage of boardoptions.com is called Your Leadership Library. As far as I know, we're the only resource that in the country that reviews books about business, strategy, corporate culture, from a board of directors perspective. Why would it be important for you to read that book? Or maybe the book's a waste of your time. So we review books that would be of interest to board members. On the left side
And
of
Larry,
the
I just want to
homepage,
say that is an invaluable resource, because I would challenge anyone that either is in the boardroom or wants to be in a boardroom to look at their nightstand. And I'm assuming they all have probably 3 to 4 different books at any given time that they're looking at. Some about learning a certain skill set. It might be tech, to learning about a new industry they might be wanting to get into or just joined into. Maybe they're learning about some brilliant people, have been successful leaders in the past, to glean stuff from that. So I imagine that is a great resource to be able to come up with that short guide list of books you want to be reading.
Yeah. Yep. Then on the left side, there's a section called Nose In, Fingers Out. You know what that means. And what it means is, if you're on a board of directors, you are responsible for asking the CEO good questions. Keep your nose in. However, keep your cotton picking fingers off the steering wheel. Don't touch the steering wheel. In other words, don't tell the CEO what to do. Because if you do, then you have to deal with the liability issues if the thing doesn't work out. That is not your role as a board. The CEO guides the ship. You're the board member. You decide, is this the right person to guide the ship? But you don't steer the ship. That is such a difficult issue for senior executives to deal with, because they're used to steering the ship.
Right.
So nose in, fingers out is all about what are the right questions to ask. And particularly if you're on the board of a nonprofit, you are often put on the board for a number of reasons that have nothing to do with your ability to understand the industry that you're part of now. And the CEO is not going to tell you what the right questions are. So we do. So we have a lot of information about questions. So all of that is in our website, boardoptions.com.
And Larry, as we wrap up here, I don't want to forget your talent banks. I think that's an important thing to tell our audience about too.
Yeah, we have 950 board members on our Board of Directors Talent Bank. You are welcome to go to boardoptions.com and apply for the Board of Directors Talent Bank. There is no charge for you to do so. I just want to be really clear. We are a B2B service. Our clients are the boards that hire us. You are not the client. So we'll look at your resume and decide, does this person have value to be on a board of directors? And we're making decisions on the best interests of our clients, not your best interests. So there's no charge to submit your credentials. There's no charge to be listed on the board talent bank, but there's no guarantee that you'll be admitted. There are 3 ways that we use the Board of Directors Talent Bank. Number 1 is, let's say a board says we're interested in getting it. We want an expert on dermatology who's an MD. We need someone like that. Do you have someone like that? We would say, well, don't trust me. Why don't you go to our Board of Directors Talent Bank, do a deep dive, do a keyword search, see if we've got somebody. Second, a company may not have the cash or the desire for a full board of directors search. No problem. We have an alternative. We have a dating service. What we say is board options is to board talent what Match.com is for marriage. You go through the talent bank, do a deep dive, come up with people you want to meet, give me the codes. I'll reach out to those people, see if they want to meet with you. We'll arrange a meeting on Zoom, and if as a result of the meeting you get a board offer, we get compensated. And if there is no match, we don't get compensated. So there's no risk for you to do that. The third way in which we make money with board options is we work with 3 or 4 smaller private equity firms. Larry, I'm thinking about making an investment in a cosmetics company, but before I do, I want to talk to a MD dermatologist who can look at the business plan and the special sauce of this company. Is this really unique? And so we would have that person on our talent bank, and then we would be compensated for making the introduction to the private equity firm. So those are the things that we do.
Well, Larry, we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for peeling back the onions a bit, not only on sort of what nominating governance committees could and should be doing, but also how the retained search can work. and it was wonderful to hear your insights. Thank you for helping all of our audience to be boardroom bound. That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Larry Stybel. It was really interesting to hear his perspective on what actually makes for a good board member, what actually makes for a good board, how to match between the two, and the expertise that they bring, and of course the resources he has available for everybody over at boardoptions.com. You want to take advantage of those because it's all about preparing ourselves, not only signing up for their database of candidates, but the education that they have available. And if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to everything we talked about today. Please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.